everybody. Welcome to the Legendarium podcast. This is episode something or other. I don't even know what episode this is going to be because this is going to come out in a few weeks. But today we are going back to the author's shelf to talk about The Black Count. This is a biography that was chosen for us by our special guest today. We'll get there in just a second. I am Craig, your host, and I just want to remind you, obviously, to go to thelegendarium.com and check out our wares there. Go to Patreon. Go to Discord, join in the conversation there on Discord. We all have a lot of fun. But now let's get to it. Let's get to our guests. Well, Ryan isn't much of a guest. In fact, I should mention, you shouldn't forget to donate to Patreon because we do need now in the studio after this book an official Legendarium guillotine just to keep him in line. It's Ryan Bruckman.
Yeah, I have nothing to go with on a guillotine. I usually stay away from those. So.
Yeah. And joining us today, we were going to get a statue of him commemorating him here in Utah, but there's a bureaucratic mess that I started just to keep that from happening. It's Brian McClellan.
Hey.
Hi, Brian. How you doing?
I'm doing great, thanks.
So Brian is, for anybody who's not familiar, and I'm sure most of our audience is already, but he's the author of the Powder Mage trilogy, among other things. But he has a new book that is, when this is released, I think it'll be just about to release like tomorrow or something. It's called In the Shadow of Lightning, a new epic fantasy. We're going to ask you more about that at the end of the show so people can stick around and hear more about In the Shadow of Lightning. You're also the host of the Page Break podcast, which you started, I want to say, within the last year and have been thoroughly embarrassing the rest of us podcasters ever since.
Yeah, I think it was maybe June of last year. So yeah, we're closing in on a year.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, it's really good. In fact, we just spoke yesterday with Scott Lynch, who was a guest on your show. And spilled all of the secrets there that then he felt safe spilling them on our show because he's like, I got the big guy first. So. Anyway, yeah, so people should go check out Page Break. All right, so we're going to get into this book, The Black Count. The author, forgive me, I forgot the author's name and I don't have the book right.
Tom Reiss.
That's right,
Reiss,
Tom Reiss.
Yeah.
This is a biographical account of Alex Dumas, the elder Alexandre Dumas. So we're all familiar with the author or the novelist from France around the turn of the 19th century, or I guess he was a little later than that. But this is about his father, who was a former slave in the sugar colonies in the Americas. He went to France. He rose in the ranks there to become a general in the French army around before and during the time of Napoleon's rise. And so around the time of the French Revolution, fascinating time and story and character. And as I sat down to try to recap it in my normal 3 paragraphs, I just threw up my hands in despair and said, you know what? You're going to have to go read it. It's a history. It's pretty interesting. But Brian, let me kick the first question to you, which is the same question I ask all of our author shelf guests, which is, why did you pick this book?
So I picked this book because it's so stinking interesting. I mean, because you and I, when we discussed me coming on here, we talked a little bit about the idea of, like often it's, like a novel that's, like a fantasy novel or something that's a little more pertinent to, what I do for a living, what the guest does for a living. And this one at first glance doesn't feel pertinent because it's real world, it's biographical, it's historical. But like once you dig into it even a little bit, this kind of thing, it's almost at the root of what I do, of where Powder Mage comes from, because Count of Monte Cristo is one of my favorite books. I read the first time I read it was one of those like abridged novels for kids, when I was 7 or 8, little kid. And then I read the unabridged, I think when I was 12. And I in
the original French, of course.
Yeah, right. But I absolutely love Alexandre Dumas. He is an amazing author. He creates such incredible stories. And Count of Monte Cristo, like I said, one of my favorite books. And so this is the true story of his father. whose life basically influenced Alexandre Dumas, the novelist's whole career. He was a very little kid when his father died, but his earliest memories were sitting on his father's knee and hearing these stories of his father's adventures as a soldier and a man about town and all of these different little things. And so this basically, in a way, kind of formulated, by kind of a chain of events, kind of formulated my own career. Because it's very, my books are flintlock fantasy. They're set very influenced by kind of the Napoleonic era, by everything that was going on geopolitically, and the big battles that happened, all this stuff. So that's why I chose it. It just kind of goes to the beginning of where I come from as an author.
I love it. And this is something that we talk about somewhat often on the show with regards to world building and how authors are able to do it. And, whether they succeed or fail, there's a lot that goes into whether they succeed or fail, including your own perceptions. But one of the things that we talk about is the complexity that they allow their world to have, or that they're capable of giving their world. One of the things that this type of book, I feel like, would be really valuable to any aspiring writer, especially somebody who's going to be world building, doing this like secondary fantasy, is you get this. This is not a very long book, right? This is for fantasy readers, it's quite a short book, but you do get glimpses, just little glimpses into how complex this society was, French society in the 17th century, the late 17th century, and how, like I said, he was a former slave in the sugar plantations in the Americas, and then he showed up, and it's like, hey, there's a society that's mostly very welcoming to somebody like you, on and off, and he had to jump certain hurdles and whatnot, and then things like really took a turn for the better in some ways when this revolution happened, but then the coup happened, and now we're all a bunch of racists again, and you're screwed. And it's the kind of thing where, I guess my point with this whole long comment is just the complexity that, cultures, nations, people aren't static over time. And there's a lot that can influence that. Anyway, so yeah, I really enjoyed that aspect of it. Ryan, did you finish the book? How'd it go?
Yes, I did finish the book.
Yes.
This is something, reading this is something different for me, and I am glad that you chose it, because the majority in the bulk of my reading, like a lot of our listeners here, sits in the fantasy science fiction realm. Jumping into a biography, I've done it a couple times with people I really admired. This is not one that was even remotely on my radar, and it requires honestly, it requires a different reading skill set to know how to get the most out of it. And the story is fascinating. I too, Count of Monte Cristo is my favorite of the classics. I also remember checking out the Great Illustrated Classics from my library, going through that one the first time, and then reading the unabridged later on. So this one, it excited me quite a bit to get to know some of the original history behind it. But the author takes a lot of time, especially early on in the book, and as he's growing up, to give you the world in which Alex grew up in, and the context in which helps you understand better just how incredible what he did is. But it takes time. Like there are a lot of times reading through it, I was sitting there going, I would go off and like, wait a minute, where are we? I've lost myself. We got away from his story for a while, and I'm like 3 paragraphs into French, geopolitical things at the time, which it's useful information for context here. But as a reader who's used to that coming in a narrative form, it was a little bit different for me to deal with that.
I really like a book like this as a jumping off point, where he'll give you 4 pages on kind of naval warfare in the Mediterranean in the year, 1799. And there's a part of you that's like, oh my gosh, can we get back to Alex Dumas, please? But he does that constantly through the whole book, and you can find those little tidbits. It's like a historical primer, right? Pointing you in so many possible directions of what might be interesting to you. I don't know. Yeah, what do you think, Brian? Does this one, does it feel like it veers off too often, or does every little tidbit fascinate you?
So I don't think it does veer off too often. I mean, I am very fascinated by this kind of by that kind of history and having it kind of plugged in. But also, like with Count of Monte Cristo, like that happens in the book. Like this was actually happens a lot in that era of kind of French novel where he just go on a total tangent about something, like the Battle of Waterloo or something like that, where you're suddenly I think Les Mis is actually like probably the worst culprit for this, where you just like suddenly pop over for 40 pages about the French sewers, crap like that. But no, I really quite love that, especially in this sort of biography, because it is so contextualizing. It's giving us a framework to understand this person and how they existed and what the people around them felt about their rise to power and fall from grace, and all of these little things that if it was pure narrative, pure biography without these little tangents, I think it would lose something.
No, yeah, I get that. I think I can see where you're coming from on that. There were times though when I was like, Alex Dumas is so fascinating. Why has it been 5 pages since I heard of him? But hey, to each their own. And I don't know. I think Ryan, I may have had an easier time with some of the tangents, so to speak, just because I was familiar. I speak French. I live there. I know the geography of Western and Southern Europe. Maybe I don't know. Maybe it was easier for me. But
Well, I'll also say that there are a handful of things also in a biography, like in anything, that when you do audiobook style, it's a little bit different.
Yeah. Yeah, I assume you did audiobook on this one.
Yeah, like there's some nice things. Hearing the French pronunciations is really nice, but I also had no so he changes his name partway through his life to kind of, I guess, stick it to his
dad. He was rejecting his father. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So he claims his mother's name, which is where we get the Dumas from. He takes his mother's name there. And so I remember through a lot of, especially the early portions, sitting here going, I know this is a story about Alex Dumas, and I'm hearing these whole other names, and like my mind wouldn't process that this is the person I'm supposed to be listening to. That. So some of that's more on me than on necessarily authorship or performance or anything like that. But
it's funny, Ryan. We here's a tangent for you to plug our Silmarillion episodes, which by this time should be wrapped up, right? But this is something we run into in the Silmarillion, where there are so many names, and I kept telling you and Kyle in the early going, like, it's okay, just let them wash over you. Like, you'll pick it up as we go. You'll kind of the important ones will float to the top as we go. Anyway, it's a bit like that, I think. I was having that toward the end of the book when there are so many characters around, around Napoleon and, new generals, old generals that had popped up throughout the book. And by the time I was at the end, I was like, oh, I can't take any more names. I can't. So I just kind of like let it wash over me. Yeah. Okay, cool. So let's see. What is there? So we've talked about the book itself a little bit. Obviously, there's a ton more to talk about. But I am curious, Brian, if the man Alex Dumas is a part of why this book is so fascinating to you, if he resonated with you, or if it's more the concept of the book as a whole. Nice one, Ryan.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, like he was fascinating. Like there's so much to take out of that, and it's hard to not mention the racial side of it, because this was somebody whose father had basically just taken a slave and fathered several children, and then ignored them for a long time, and then suddenly came back and said, I kind of want a son, and I want to put him through French society, and like literally sold Alex into slavery as a child, like freed him from slavery, sold him back into slavery to pay for the boat ride to get back to France, and then like basically he like pawned his child and then bought him back and then put him through school and put him into high society, and gave him this really privileged life that was kind of bizarre for someone that started where he did. But then Alex himself took advantage of that. He was very smart. He was very courageous. He was a statuesque person. He took advantage of everything that was given to him and then became a national hero, essentially. And, eventually, he defeated armies. He went on like special missions himself with his soldiers. He became the equivalent of a 4-star general today. Before he hit his 30s. He didn't live very long. I think he passed away at 43, I want to say.
Something like that, yeah.
But he, this man lived a life that was genuinely incredible by any standards. This guy pissed off Napoleon. He became one of the favorites and then lost that status because he had a very strict morality and he felt certain ways that pissed off the little general, and so you've got this crazy life of ups and downs it's the kind of thing that it's almost too amazing to be real, but that's what makes it so amazing, right?
That's why I love him as a protagonist in this story. I mean, it's his biography. This is a real life, but if you think about it in kind of novelized terms, this is exactly who you would want to tell a story about. Somebody who is kind of straddling several different worlds, and as society changes its views, his fortunes rise and fall with that. It's a very tumultuous life. So yeah, he made, again, the equivalent of a 4-star general, but then after a little while, he falls out of favor. And blacks as military commanders fall out of favor, and so he gets busted down. And now he's leading, a very small contingent of, I want to say, like mounted troops. And I might be getting some of the details wrong, but the point being, he still is distinguishing himself and creating these legends about the guy who held the bridge by himself against 30 Austrians for 3 hours or whatever it was. Like amazing stuff.
Yeah, just a real life figure that could be from a book, and basically gave us an entire genre, right? Because of his son, and that's incredible in a way. Just seeing the way that his influence created, the Count of Monte Cristo and the career of Alexandre Dumas, the author, and all of that kind of effect on, so his life gave birth to, almost like our modern idea of, kind of the adventure novel, right? And that's crazy.
Yeah. It's amazing. The only Dumas that I have read in the original French, that's where I get to kind of brush off my shoulders, right? Is the Three Musketeers. I read the Three Musketeers. I did appreciate a few nods to that in this book. Anyway, and yeah, he gave some of his father's exploits to the characters in the Three Musketeers, D'Artagnan especially. But that's a fun book to read. I can't remember, Ryan. I might have told this story on the show before, but here's a little detour we're going to take to talk about the novelist Alexandre Dumas and how prolific he was. We live in the state of Utah where someone casts a large looming shadow by how many books he writes every year. We won't mention him by name, but even he's got to feel bad about how fast Alexandre Dumas wrote. So here's my fun anecdote. I was reading The Three Musketeers in French, and it was an annotated copy. Some professor there in France had done an annotated copy, and he was talking about how he wrote 20,000 words a week with a quill, and he would write and write and write, and he was having great fun with this adventure story with the Three Musketeers. D'Artagnan, in the middle of the book, D'Artagnan makes it to Paris, joins the Musketeers. The king makes him a Musketeer. Congratulations, you got everything your heart ever desired. And Alexandre Dumas woke up the next day, according to this professor, he woke up the next day and had been writing so fast and furiously that he forgot that he had made D'Artagnan a Musketeer. And so in the official novel, I think it was serialized at the time, right? But in the official account, he wakes up the next day and has to claim his place as a Musketeer. Again, that's how fast this guy wrote. His brain couldn't even keep up with itself. Pretty incredible stuff. If anybody hasn't read any Alexandre Dumas books, do it, please. They're amazing to this day. So, okay. What else do we want to talk about? I've got a few things, but I want to kick it to you guys so I'm not steering the entire conversation.
I have a question first for both of you. Do you have a specific event or occurrence in Alex's life that stood out like that was my favorite moment? The things. Mine, I don't know why it stuck out of all the amazing great things, but when he is leading I think it was the Black Legion or whatever, they're going through this field and there's a battalion that just kind of pops out of nowhere on them, and he saves someone by he shoots the barrel of another gun.
Oh, right.
Remember that one?
He splits the barrel.
Yeah, he pulls a Robin Hood with a flintlock pistol type thing that just does if you've ever shot a black powder rifle or anything like that, the idea of actually pulling that off is just insane on its face. So, but I don't know.
And it's
favorite moments.
It's one of those things where you kind of figure that can't be real. Like the story of him lifting a horse with his thigh,
with his
and
legs.
He's hanging onto a tree branch. Like, okay, obviously apocryphal. But apparently,
I've seen that Old Spice commercial.
But apparently, people kept the split rifle, right? Like that was a thing that got passed around. So who knows if the story is like technically accurate? But it's a great story.
Well, the horse thing was what I was actually going to bring up, because I find it funny, even if it's not true. It's an interesting bit of, because like as Americans, we're raised on kind of tall tales, right? Like, these bigger than life sort of characters that we know that the tall tales is like 90% made up, right? And so I'm fascinated by this kind of aspect of the horse story of being, lifted, grabbing on a branch and then, tightening his, thighs, I guess, and lifting his horse, right? Like, That's obviously insane, but it's such a funny little thing because it feels like a tall tale to me. It feels like one of those little bits of, this is how we like learn about this character from our history kind of thing, except it's French rather than American. And I very much loved that because it reflects, even if not true, as we're certain, it reflects the way that stories developed around this character and what type of things people would make up about him or even embellish about him, right? And I love that.
I think if I had to choose a favorite moment, Ryan, it would be it not because it was rah rah go get him, but kind of the poignancy of it was the description of when he was released. So he was a prisoner of war for 2 years in Italy. He got extremely sick, possibly poisoned, definitely hurt more by the doctor's treatments than the disease. So by the time he gets back to France, he had been, like Brian said, this statuesque 6'2", what would he have been? Maybe 250-pound black man, just built. You're right. Like this dude was tough. And by the time he gets back to France after 2 years in an Italian prison, he's wasted away. He's blind in one eye. He's mostly deaf. Just things have gone really wrong. And the way that he describes how the homecoming would have gone, with the wife kind of struggling to hide her shock at his appearance. But that, and ultimately, overcoming that and, hey, it's a joyous reunion and all that. But that coupled with the letters that we get kind of peppered throughout the book, and then the letters pick up with more and more frequency toward the end as he's writing back to his wife during these campaigns. So I got a sense of how much he and his wife loved each other. Constantly, he would refer to her as, or refer to himself as your best friend, always and forever. Like, I thought it was just so, so sweet. And so when they got their reunion, I felt that a little bit. So yeah, I liked that. The other thing that I really liked, and maybe this is another direction we can take it, is how how should I put it? The man of principle. I can't remember who mentioned this. Brian, you might have said, he's a man of strong principles. The other moment that really stuck out to me was he got the assignment to carry out the war in the west of France, kind of around the time of the revolution, I can't remember what region it was in now. I apologize. But it was this rebellious region of France, and the quote unquote, the Republicans at the time, they wanted to bring them under the heel of the new regime. And so they send him out there, and he discovers all sorts of atrocities being committed by his troops. And other generals around him were either participating in that or kind of turning a blind eye to it. And he risked a lot to bring his troops in line and to stop those atrocities as best he could. And that's a through line through the entire book, and his career is him having actual principles in the face of a society that is waffling and changing constantly with the tides of populism, basically.
Well, and as you say, it was a very dangerous time to be principled. During that revolutionary era, during Napoleon's rise, it was sorry. If you said the wrong thing, it didn't matter what kind of power you had or you thought you had, you might end up on the guillotine. It was the political situation was terrifying to anyone trying to put their foot down about anything, because you never knew which way the wind would blow on that sort of thing. You might not even know who was in power back in Paris at the moment. And so that kind of stuff was crazy. And being principled at all was very risky.
Yeah. Ryan, do you have any principles, or do you just kind of float through life?
I keep them in a box over there. I pull them out when I need them. I try and avoid that, yeah.
They're by my lightsabers.
Exactly.
Those are your principles, right?
Yes.
Speaking of digressions, Ryan, that's quite the setup you've got there. Those are quite the digs. I hope people are watching this on YouTube, as not just listening on the podcast, because Ryan's room is incredible. Wow.
I redid my studio space to bring it up to wife-approved standards. So no more stapled foam on the wall. It's all acoustic tiles and LED lights and curtains.
It looks rave ready, my friend.
Yep.
Okay, cool. So I feel like I wrested the conversation back. Brian, any other points you want to bring up? Just favorite moments, things that you love, bullet points, I guess, from this book.
Something that really stuck with me. So I listened to the audiobook this about 8 years ago. And it's and I reread it once, I think about 5 years ago, the physical form. And then I did a little bit of kind of glancing through it in prep for this podcast. But something that stuck through me all the way through was this idea that it's alluded to, I think, in the prologue. This idea of memory, like to Alexandre Dumas, the greatest sin a villain could commit was forcing our heroes to be forgotten. And he felt that that's what had happened to his father. His father had been forgotten, and that was the great sin. And something that I found really cool, that like genuinely gave me goosebumps, was this idea that that revenge that Alexandre Dumas took on behalf of his father was becoming one of the most successful authors in human history. And turning his father's story into, what we know as the adventure genre of the world right now. And I absolutely love that. That's such a fantastic sort of angle to the entire the entire series of kind of events that takes place from the beginning of Alex Dumas' life to his through his son's career. And and also he's had several very famous progeny. He's like I think his grandson ended up as a very famous playwright in France. I think his fourth great grandson was a gold medalist in the 1920s or something like that. This family created amazing things, and for somebody who lost favor during the Napoleonic era and was forgotten in a lot of ways, that's really incredible that the legacy remained like that.
Yeah, he remained a larger than life figure in French culture for a while, to the point where he did have a statue. There was a statue of him, his son, and his grandson in a square in Paris, and then the Nazis tore down his statue for Nazi reasons,
right?
And at the time that this book was published, so this was published in 2013. I think he did a lot of his research in 2011, 2012. He visited that square and saw that there still wasn't a statue. There were people who were fighting to keep that memory alive of this guy. And he still didn't have a statue by the time the book was published. I looked it up. There is now a monument dedicated to Alex Dumas. It's a very large pair of open or broken shackles in Paris, but there's still no statue of him. And I kind of feel that idea that the greatest sin is to forget. I mean, it's a terrible fate for somebody who did so much and who had such an interesting life. Yeah. Ryan, are you writing my biography, or is it going to be a good one?
I'm not sure how people are going to take with a coloring book biography setup, but that's what it's going to be.
Cool. Great. What else do we want to spend our last few minutes on? I figure we've got about 10, 15 minutes left. We can talk about the book if we have other things we want to get into. Do we want? Sorry, go on.
For a half second here, we briefly touched on it at the beginning as we introduced things, but pretty much all of us have a love and appreciation for the author Alexandre Dumas and his work. It is very interesting to me now, having read this. I feel like if you are a fan of that book, you should come in and read this, because it changes the insight of the villain, especially the villains. But I mean, yes, the count, things like that, but especially the villains in his stories. They talked about the way that Richelieu is used multiple times and things, and to me, it was just really interesting to go through this and then think back and go, oh wait, I see now why this character, see why some of these villains might be this way for Alexander, because he's pulling this from his father's story to a certain extent. Like they say, write what you know, and this is clearly something that he knew, at least from the perspective of a child, how he saw it. I think there's some wonderful insights into these classics inside this book.
Oh, very much so. Yeah. It's the kind of the way that the villains that he has are, I mean, I was mentioning this, but the way that the villains kind of, they move on and they forget, in Count of Monte Cristo, they've forgotten about Edmond Dantes. They don't care. This was some dumb thing that happened, 25 years ago or whatever. And, but they also have these very complex lives with different horrors or different redemptions or different, all of his characters are very complicated and interesting. And I've got to imagine that that comes also from his father's stories of, there were racist generals that his father won over just by being awesome, things like that, these, the way that the characters change and develop and have good multifaceted bases and histories. I absolutely love that.
Yeah. It's oh no, never mind. I'll skip past that. I will say, what? I was going to bring up the 3 levels, Ryan. So for anybody unfamiliar with the 3 level theory that we've been talking about now for 7 years on the podcast, whatever it's been. This is the idea of when you're telling a story, especially if you're writing fiction, but you could say the same about any story, that this is storytelling. This biographer is telling a story of a man. There's the first level 1, that's your surface level story, the actual plot as it happens. Then there's level 2, where you might get into socio-political commentary. A lot of authors love to live on level 2, right? And then there's level 3, and that's the kind of the personal applicability. What is it that I can take from this to make me a better person in my relations with those immediately around me, right? Including myself. Anyway, I was struck by, like, if Todd had been on this episode, Ryan, he'd be in tears the entire time talking about nothing but level 3 stuff, because there's a ton of that in here. And the idea that we've already talked about being a principled person in an unprincipled society. And I wanted to kind of dig just a little bit into that and bring up the idea of now my thoughts are fleeing my mind, you guys. This is why I shouldn't do 2 author shelves 2 days in a row. But the idea of crowds. Ryan, you've heard me bring this up a lot. I hate crowds. I hate everything about them. Well, not everything about them, but for the most part, this idea of a crowd. And this story kind of just touches on, but it doesn't quite dig into why Alex's fortunes would have changed so dramatically throughout his career. And it's because of crowds. And it's something that the reason I bring up the 3 levels is because I feel like this is a real level 3 thing. Like, how can I focus on principles and, maintaining, my core beliefs, whatever, in the face of whatever's happening. We see a ton of populism happening all around us today. And you pick any era in history, it's always going on. There's crowds are always, following the next thing, or turning on this or turning toward that. And Alex Dumas, I thought was a great example of somebody who had principles, and to the best that he could, as far as we're reading, stuck with them. And it made his life really tough at certain points, right? Really great in others. But it's hard to be it's hard to be a stick in the river, right? With everything running around you. Anyway, love that guy. Okay. Anything else before we kind of wrap up our conversation on the Black Count? Final thoughts. Let me ask you this for a final thought. For those who are listening who haven't read this book, I think it's valuable in its own right. On its own terms, go read the book. It's very interesting. It's absolutely worthwhile. Would this help Legendarium listeners who are big fans of fantasy and science fiction? Will this help them be better readers of fantasy and science fiction?
I mean, I think so.
I do as well, but yeah, go on.
I think so. I think it's a way to understand a lot of the real world setting that is taken as inspiration for writers. For me in particular, as I mentioned before, I write flintlock fantasy. This is very much the kind of real world time period that I am trying to get the flavor of for my books. And so incredibly invaluable for somebody like me. But I think that for anybody who reads and writes, they want something like this helps give real context to what to stories that may otherwise not be able to delve in too much into the geopolitics of, an era or of a particular kingdom even, or, all these. It adds depth to a reader and a writer's understanding of how decisions are made, how countries become, right? Like the Napoleonic era shaped Europe for a very long time and still kind of reverberates, right? And so yeah, I think it's massively valuable.
I think the idea of context is huge. I've heard criticisms about this book or that book or whatever, that I didn't get enough information about how how the society would work. This doesn't make any sense to me. And it's like, well, yeah, maybe you don't have the historical literacy to fill in those cracks that you're talking about, to give it that context. And you can argue. Anybody could argue about whether the author should be filling those cracks in for you, but it's a way that you can kind of give yourself a better shot at understanding a world that an author is creating. Right, Ryan, thoughts, feelings?
I'm mostly in agreement. I do think that this book will have a bigger impact on someone who also wants to write than someone who's just reading for enjoyment, because it does provide context. It does give you those things. But similarly to your point about just being a more well-versed reader in different eras, things like that, if you know that the authors that you enjoy are writing in these styles, these eras, then knowing that source material is going to give you a better insight into why some of those things work. And there's also just the reality that sometimes the truth can be stranger than fiction. And some of these stories, like you might, if you read some of these things in a fantasy novel, you'd be like, dude, this author's jumped the shark. That doesn't happen. This gives you some context to say, no, this legitimately is how some of these things worked and how this happened. So it will benefit a reader. I think it's a greater benefit for those who want to be authors, but there is place for it.
Yeah. Cool. Well, wrapping this one up, I'd say it's a big hearty thumbs up from me. I will say, after the first couple of chapters, I was a little bit dubious. I was like, I don't know where this is going to go. And, it was a new kind of writing style, like Ryan mentioned. I had to change my brain space. But, after a few chapters, I was definitely sucked in. And by the time I got to the end of it, it felt like I'd been on a journey. Definitely recommend it, that people go check it out if they haven't yet. This episode will have been announced, so I hope that a lot of people had the chance to go pick up the book and give it a shot before we had this discussion. But if you haven't, please do so. You will thank me and yourself and Brian McClellan for it later. So, Brian, thank you so much for selecting this book. It was excellent. But now I think we need to turn our attention for just a few minutes to some upcoming projects of yours that I teased at the beginning of the show. You have a book coming out tomorrow if our release schedule holds. Tell us about the book.
Okay, so this is my new epic fantasy. So I made my career, as we mentioned a couple times, off of Powder Mage. 6 big fat fantasy novels, 2 trilogies, a bunch of short stuff on the side. But I'm kind of moving on to the next part of my career. And I've got a new series coming out. Totally new world, In the Shadow of Lightning. It's the series is called Glass Immortals, and this is in a similar vein to Powder Mage in that it is flintlock epic fantasy that takes place in a world in which magic is made. It is magic is something called
like manufactured.
It's manufactured, yes. So it's called God Glass, and it's literally made in glassworks. And these little tiny baubles that you put in your ear or in whatever piercings you have, or you just hold it. And these baubles basically enhance, depending on the way that they're made, they enhance your native capabilities. So forge glass will make you stronger and faster. Wit glass will make your brain move faster. Daze glass will just it gets you stoned, essentially. We have all of these different types of glass that are made, they're produced manufactured for anyone. Obviously, the wealthy are able to get their hands on the very best, but anybody, teamsters use forged glass just to move barrels of wine. It's an incredibly entrenched in this fantasy world. And at the very beginning of the book, we find out that the materials used to make God Glass are running out quickly. And so it's a kind of a fun meditation on magic as a limited resource, which is very enjoyable to me from kind of like a geopolitical sense of, like, how does this affect the world? And so we enter this.
This is your Dune, Brian. This is your Dune.
It takes a little more from Dune than I probably want to admit, which was mostly subconscious. I very much developed this world, and my wife went, "There's a lot of Dune in this," and I went, "Oh, yeah. Well, you know what? I'm fine with that. I love Dune." So, but yeah, so it's basically this kind of setting. That's very British Empire at its height. But if it was run by gangsters, essentially, I was trying to kind of combine the British Empire with Republic Rome, with these massive families that essentially run everything, these big merchant families. And so we basically enter this world with a character named Demir Grappo, who was a failed prodigy. He basically was the up-and-coming thing. You kind of think, Julius Caesar, Napoleon, that type of... He was just incredibly savvy as a politician, as a general, just very good at everything. A child prodigy. And then he had a horrible disaster that ended his political career, and he went into self-exile. And we pick up this book when he finds out that his mother's been killed, and he has to come back to the capital and basically take his spot as head of their small guild family. And so we've got immediately scarce resources and revenge. And everything is basically rolling from there. It was such a fun book to write. It's been in my head for a long time, and I'm very excited for people to get to read it.
And yeah, I hope people are excited as well. Ryan, you picking up a copy of that, I assume? We'll have one in the studio shelves, of course.
I've read the Powder Mage set. I've enjoyed those, so I'm looking forward to what you have next.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, I hope people go check it out. Like I said, if the release schedule holds, it'll be out midnight tonight. Okay, so go line up at your local Barnes and Noble, and tell us about Page Break. Okay, so yeah, it's been around for a year, but I'm sure a lot of people haven't heard of this yet. So tell us what you're doing with Page Break.
So Page Break is my podcast, and I had it was a podcast that I'd had a thought about for many years before I started it, but the pandemic kind of continuing to drag on basically forced my hand of saying, I'm really sick of not being able to chat with my author friends. Because that's what conventions are for. You go and you do panels and you sign books, but you also get to go to the bar and hang out with authors you only see once a year. And so my podcast basically comes from the idea of, I want to have these casual conversations, and I'll record them and put them out. And that's what it's been. I think I'm at closing in on episode 40 now. So 40 or so episodes, conversations with different creative professionals. I've got a few YouTubers, I've got an actor, I've got role-playing developers, lots of authors, science fiction, fantasy, but mostly, yeah, it's meant to just be casual chats. And sometimes we spend 45 minutes complaining about Twitter, and sometimes we get super philosophical and talk about all sorts of random stuff. But lots of writing chat.
About Twitter.
Yeah, lots of writing chat, lots of that kind of stuff.
complaining about Twitter is like the basis of my whole philosophy. So if I'm getting super philosophical, that's where we're starting from. So.
Well, I mean, like I think everybody these days, especially in creative fields, has a very complicated relationship with social media, and so it gets brought up way too much.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. Well, yeah, it's really, really interesting. Again, people go check that out. I know that I got a little taste of what you talked about with Scott Lynch. I don't know if that episode's out yet, but I'll have to go check it out because it's fascinating stuff, and he's got a lot of interesting things coming up. They're out by now. People know, so it's fine. Cool. Well, Brian, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you again for choosing this book. It's like Ryan often says after we do Author Shelves books, and you kind of alluded to this earlier, we never would have picked this up without you. It wasn't on my radar. Never would have thought of it. And I'm really, really glad I read it. And I hope other people do as well. So let's see. Go to thelegendarium.com, Patreon, Discord, all the stuff. Go buy a copy of In the Shadow of Lightning. Go subscribe to Page Break. And for heaven's sake, stick around for next week's episode, which will be on something. We're recording this a month in advance, so I have no idea. But listen in and enjoy. Thanks, guys.